Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. The title of my presentation is a little bit ominous, I think. Are we ready for our autonomous future? I'm a big fan of science fiction, and in particular science fiction movies. And so, autonomy and technology and digitalization and so on features very heavily. And when I started thinking about what does our autonomous future look like, the first thing that came into my head was this, which maybe is a little bit of a dystopian view on an autonomous future. If we're a little bit more optimistic, we're talking about something like this. So this is maybe a bit more suitable for our forum here today. And as the speakers have talked to me about before me, is that when we think about sort of the future and the future of the city, two things that really are important is transport and autonomy. And of course, in order to have that, we need to have good communications and so on. But for me today, what I'm going to talk about a little bit more is the transport, because that's an area that I am particularly interested in. And I don't think that you can talk about smart cities or any kind of future society without actually thinking about the transportation aspect of it. And when you look back sort of through the decades, through to the last century, you see that whenever people have thought about the future, transportation has always been a really key aspect. Here, for example, you can see, might not be very clear to you at the back, but two sort of depictions of future cities. The one on the left-hand side, the black and white, is actually from 1925. And when they were trying to think about the city of the future, which for them was in the 1950s, and they considered that it would be some kind of a layered city. So actually here, you have different layers. This is the top level open air for pedestrians, and then underneath here you would have a layer for slow-moving traffic, a layer for faster-moving traffic, and then a layer for electric trains and so on. So it's quite interesting how they thought that this future city might look like. And the whole point of actually having this set up was to try and reduce congestion, which is a problem that we're still trying to get around today and that we know is going to still be a problem for us in the future. Here then is some art that is a little bit more from the mid-century, around the 1950s, 1960s. And this is a lot more kind of typical of what you see in the kind of science fiction movies and so on, where again, transport is really one of the features, the really key central features of that future idea of what our society might look like. But of course here, instead of having the transport under the ground, they start to move it over the ground. So the point here is that really, we've been thinking about transportation for a long time, and it's very hard to kind of remove that from our idea of how a future city might look. And more recently, and certainly within the last sort of few years, is that we've started to see that the advances that we have made in digitalization and in automation have started to make what we previously thought was impossible or science fiction, it starts to become a lot more possible. And so we see things like Airbus is promising that we'll have autonomous flying taxis in the very near future, we'll see. We also now have driverless cars. Those are a reality. They're just not very common yet on the road. And even here in Norway, we now have autonomous minibuses on the roads in at least 3 or 4 areas that I know of. So it really is starting to happen for us. And when we think about the smart city, any kind of model that you see of a smart city always includes some sort of smart mobility options as well. Public transport is going to become very important for us, and the whole reason is, as was said earlier today, is to try and reduce congestion, try to make the city a nicer place for people to live, reducing the impact on the environment and so on. But is it realistic that we think that, when we talk about these smart city solutions, inevitably they tend to be very focused on public transport and very little on actually having cars? And is the idea of having a personal car in the future, is it realistic or not? That's one of the questions that I'm trying to think about. When you look at some of the headlines that have been in the newspapers over the last few years, we see that more and more cities are starting to try to implement some sort of car-free zones. And there was one headline that said only about 20% of Americans will own a car within 15 years, actually, which is quite soon. But when we start to look at initiatives within Oslo to try and get cars off the city streets, suddenly when it becomes personal, are you willing to give up your car? People are a little bit more reluctant. Most recently, I was at the ITS World Congress in Copenhagen in September, and some of the people here in the audience were there as well. It's very nice to see you all again. And one of the key focuses in some of the discussions that I had there was really on this idea of sustainable mobility in the future. How do we reduce congestion? And creating a better environment for people. And so there was a lot of discussions around how can we get people to give up their personal vehicles? How can we give people incentives to use public transport? And there were, a lot of startup companies and researchers there saying, well, it's down to we need to have apps so that people can have ticketless transport experiences. You don't have to go and queue at a ticket machine anymore, that the apps should be capable of following you throughout your journey so that if you have to take a bus and then change to take a train, you don't need to get a new ticket every time. The app will actually follow you and will automatically buy you a ticket. But overall, whilst these ideas are really interesting and they're good ideas to have, we still see that people are reluctant to give up their cars when it really comes down to it. And when we think about why people are reluctant to use public transport more, I think after the event in Copenhagen, I was in Manchester, and on my way to the airport, I was taking a train. It was a very old diesel train, and we were chugging along. There was fumes coming into the carriage. It was extremely unpleasant and noisy, and I was reading the free newspaper, and this page caught my eye. And it was talking about tube turmoil in London. So there was absolute chaos on the tube that day, which is pretty normal for London. Up here, you might not be able to see it, but they were actually talking about how Heathrow Airport, all of the screens went down. So they were using whiteboards to actually tell people which gates they should go to. And then almost taking up over half of the page is this beautiful ad for a new Land Rover saying it's specifically adapted to the city. So when you're getting messages like that, it's very easy to see why people still want to use their cars. So where do we go from here? Well, experts at MIT and other places like that tell us that it could be up to 4 decades before autonomous transport is really good enough to have it on a wide scale in cities. So until then, it's not going to be a regular feature that we can just sort of give up the cars because the autonomous transport options will be good enough. And this is partly because of the technology, limitations in the technology and the fact that we just don't understand it well enough, but also partly because the regulations aren't in place, the governance isn't in place for this future vision. And even though we have these pilots with minibuses and things like that now, and obviously there's a lot of research and development going into autonomous options for goods delivery as well as public transport, we're just not there yet. We as a society are not at the point yet that we're ready to take that over. Part of it is due to the concept that people have around the reliability of this technology. When it comes to public transport, even if we see these minibuses that work very well, they are small, they are limited speed, so they're not really going to allow us to take over or to deal with sort of rush hour capacity needs within the near future. And when we think about, the other public transport options, they're not reliable, they're expensive, they're not pleasant to use, and so people will default to using their own cars. So why is that a problem? Well, part of the issue for me is that when we think about the modern car, it's becoming increasingly complex and sophisticated. There's an awful lot of technology. So in the average car these days, you have quite a few sensors, and this is one of the simpler pictures that I was able to find. But sensors that are sort of, pointing out from all aspects of the car. And all of these technologies are meant to actually make the car safer to use, but we're not really seeing that they are making things safer for us. What I'm concerned about from the human factors point of view is this part down here, which is how well do drivers actually understand the technology. And there was a survey done in 2017 in the Netherlands where they said that less than 24% of people who buy a new car have any instruction in how to use the features in that car. And I know myself from the car that I drive at the moment, that which I bought secondhand. I think I had about 5 minutes with the car dealer, the salesman, where he very quickly pointed out some things to me and then sent me on my way. The problem with that is that when you have technologies like advanced cruise control, for example, you can't really test that out and teach yourself how to use it in your driveway. The only time that you get to test it out and teach yourself how to use it is when you're on the road with other drivers. And so there is a real danger there that we're putting people into very complex, very sophisticated machines that they don't really understand how to use, that they don't have any education on or instruction on, and they're using them in areas where there are other people. So it creates a little bit of a hidden danger, possibly. And I want to give you two examples. One is a case from a few years ago called, well, I've called it the runaway Toyota. But this was back in sort of 2006, 2007, Toyota had a bit of a problem with unintended acceleration of the Toyota Prius, where for some reasons the accelerator pedal would get stuck and the cars would continue to accelerate, and even if you were braking, it wouldn't actually make any difference to the car. And there was one case in particular that stood out to me where the person was driving on a highway in the US, driving, about 70 miles an hour, and the car started accelerating. They were also going down quite a steep hill, and the car was accelerating faster and faster and faster. And the person started to panic. And the first thing that they tried to do was to shift the car into neutral. That didn't do anything. They tried braking, of course, that didn't do anything. And then they started sort of repeatedly jabbing at the engine start-stop button to try and get the engine to switch off. But the car is designed so that when you're driving, and in particular when you're accelerating, if you accidentally press the engine start-stop button, it's not going to turn the engine off, because they want to avoid people unintentionally turning off the engine while they're driving. So while this person is pressing the button, nothing was happening. And so there was a lot of problems around the design of this, because it was actually designed by a software engineer. Apologies if there are any software engineers in the audience today. But it was designed so that you have to hold it down, almost like a computer button, for 3 seconds before it turns off. Now, that makes perfect sense when you're in a design room. If you're surrounded by computers, if you're used to using computers, it makes a lot of sense that if you want to restart it, you hold down the button. But if your car is hurtling down the road at 90 miles an hour and you're panicking, that doesn't make any sense to you. And so it's this lack of a human-centered design approach that actually caused the problem in this case. I think that the person was eventually able to stop the car, but you can imagine his panic at the time. And so one of the concerns that I have is that actually in the cars, even with this more basic technology, it's not very intuitive. And so we can't really just assume that people will know how to use this technology if we put them in the car, especially in an emergency scenario. So it didn't adequately consider human behavior and expectations. Wow, 2 minutes, okay. Especially if they're in an emergency situation. Okay, I'm going to speed up. The next one then is the misunderstood Volvo. Apologies to Torbjörn, but it's not pointing out a fault with the car. So here we have, some of you may have seen this video. It's horrendous. We'll see if it works now. But this was at a car dealership where they were demonstrating some new features on the car, and in particular, the pedestrian detection system. So we'll just see if this works. So they wanted to show off this pedestrian detection system, which should actually make the car stop when it detects that there's a pedestrian in front of them. What they didn't realize is that the pedestrian detection system wasn't actually installed in this car. And given that this is a car dealership, he really should have known that. But it's an optional extra. It wasn't installed as standard. But also, after this, and I should point out that the guy is okay. He had some bruises, but he did survive. But also after this, Volvo released a press statement saying that's also not how the technology works. No normal person is going to drive into a group of people. So the system isn't actually designed to work in that way, where you would accelerate into a group. It's designed so that if you're driving down the street and somebody steps in front of the car, it will stop, but not when you're accelerating. It assumes that the normal person, if that happened, would actually brake. So again, it comes down to this idea of, people just don't fully understand how the technology works. And when you see how some of these cars are advertised these days, particularly with features like automatic pedestrian detection, they're sort of advertised in a way that shows off like the car can do anything and I can just take my hands off the wheel and do whatever. I'm not even going to talk about Tesla in this presentation. And so we have a lot of questions that remain unanswered. So things around the level of intuitiveness or transparency of the new automation that is in cars today. And are there additional training requirements for those? How does the technology work in emergency scenarios when we know that people behave differently in emergency scenarios? So what are the driver's expectations about how the technology should work as well? That's very important. How might the technology fail in extreme circumstances, such as, the Nordic climate is pretty extreme. So we're very interested to see how it might work there. So for us, we think that we really need to take a more human-centered approach to the development of technology. We need to adequately consider how humans actually behave, both in normal circumstances and in emergencies. At IFA, we have over 25 years' experience of looking at how people behave in very digital and technologically advanced arenas, such as control rooms. And we see that people don't always react as you would expect them to react. And there are implications across the board for this, for a host of different groups of people. We all need to sort of work together to try and fix this problem. It's a fact that cars are going to be a part of our lives for a long time yet. When we look at, for example, predictions of the future of mobility, this is from Deloitte, they said that there's going to be 4 existing states in the future. It's not going to just automatically go to totally autonomous vehicles and no personal cars, that there will still in the future be some cars that are driven by people, some car sharing, some driverless cars, and some autonomous transportation fleets. So we need to sort of be aware of that might actually be our future reality. And so although it is well and good to focus on having fully autonomous transportation systems in the future, and that research is, of course, very necessary and very important for us, we can't forget that we might also still have these old cars that have some fancy features in them, like pedestrian detection systems and so on. So what does this mean for the smart city initiatives? Well, we know that in smart cities, transport is really important for us. But we need to be aware that the technology, it is advancing very rapidly, but we need to make sure that we understand how it is used and how we think it will be used by people. We need to accept that there is going to be a longer time scale for this. So we are talking about 30 or 40 years maybe before the autonomous technology is good enough that we'll see it widespread. And in the meantime, we are going to have this mix of technologies on the roads. So we need to look into that as well to make sure that it stays safe. Driverless minibuses, I don't mean to pick on those in particular, but they're the ones that we see actually on the roads in Norway, as well as the Teslas and the trucks and so on. Those are a great step forwards, but they are only one step. We need better cooperation and integration between all different players in this. So the research, the academics, industry people, government, and so on. And we need to share that information between us so that we're all on the same page when it comes to looking at how this technology works in reality. And we need to take both a top-down and a bottom-up approach, and we need to make sure that it's human-centered. So we need to have that plan for the future, but in the meantime, we need to look at what are the problems that we have to deal with today. If we can understand the technology that we have on the road today, it's going to make us much more equipped to understand what we need for the future. And in addition, it will also help us to convince the public to come with us, because we can show them that we are working safely, that we do understand how this technology works. Thank you.